Good morning, everyone. Please allow me to introduce myself. I'm Robert Cassidy from Bothwell, Tasmania. Despite my accent, I've been an Australian citizen since 11 February 2005. I've held the highest available pilot license from 7 countries, earning my first airline transport pilot license on 31 December 1982. Then I earned the highest available pilot license for helicopters, the instrument airline transport pilot license, on 5 October 1983. I've held commercial single and multi-engine seaplane pilot license. I've held the highest available flying instructor ratings for single and multi-engine airplanes and helicopters, allowing me to teach pilots to fly with reference to instruments in fog, clouds, and at night without a natural horizon from 1981 and 1987, respectively, until 2013, though I could only ever achieve Grade 2 flying instructor in Australia, which expired after only 2 years. I've held an FAA aircraft mechanic license for airframe and power plant, for aeroplanes and helicopters since 1993, but I could never achieve that in Australia, as wrenches work differently here, I suppose. I served as a U.S. Army trained helicopter pilot, maintenance officer, and maintenance test pilot. I've flown approximately 130 different aircraft to include single and multi-engine airplanes, single and multi-engine seaplanes, single and multi-engine helicopters, 2- and 4-engine turboprops, and jets, including serving as a captain of Boeing 747-400, 747-300, and 747-200 jumbo jets, as well as Boeing 737-800 and 737-700 jets like Qantas. I made my first trip as a new captain flying a Boeing 747-400 jumbo jet to Australia, 20 September 1999. Throughout my career, spanning 36 years, I fought hard against hostile forces and commercial pressures to maintain a perfect aviation safety record. I've enjoyed a career that has taken me to 47 countries. I've been a published aviation safety writer since 1983, and I'm a published author of my autobiography titled Dancing with Clouds, which is in the National Library. I have no axe to grind against CASA. I'm just passionate about aviation, which is my reason for making this submission. When I separated from active duty with the U.S. Army as a Bell Iroquois pilot to pursue a civilian aviation career March 1982, I was 28 years old. Back then, I fully expected I would still be earning my living as a pilot well into my 70s. And that means I have another decade of usefulness as a pilot. And why not, if I can still pass an aviation medical examination? The egregious costs to keep my Australian pilot license, command instrument rating, Class 1 aviation medical, and aviation security identification card valid are more than I can afford. I believe the real reason for the decline of general aviation is the egregious overregulation, verbosity, the regulatory complexity, and the cost burden on everyone involved for no added safety benefit. To purchase several volumes of CASA regulations is nearly $500 compared to $25 for the FAA that comes in one book. I believe I have provided sufficient information in the attachments of my written submission to prove that aviation safety statistics for Australia are worse than for the U.S., though CASA has wrapped every aspect of aviation in cotton wool that does not involve straight and level, fair weather flying. One key indicator of the health of the aviation industry is the number of pilots with expired instrument ratings, those whom hold current instrument ratings, and those applying for new instrument ratings compared to the entire pilot population over the past decade. I cannot get any statistical data from CASA about those numbers. I was refused or was told I would have to pay a fee, yet they provide other statistical data supporting their agenda. Perhaps the Senate committee can force the issue with CASA to get at the truth, to understand the real health of Australia's aviation industry. To know that, you should know what contribution general aviation makes to the gross domestic product and employment statistics. Just to recap the definition of an instrument rating, it allows a pilot to take off and land in foggy conditions, fly through clouds, and fly at night by reference to cockpit instrumentation, without reference to a natural horizon. What is the value of an instrument rating? According to the Australian Transport Safety Bureau, in the decade from 1 July 2009 to 30 June 2019, 101 occurrences of continued flight visually into fog or clouds obscuring forward visibility and terrain were reported to the ATSB. Of those, 9 were accidents resulting in 21 fatalities. That is, about 1 in 10 aircraft flying by visual flight rules into weather the pilot cannot see the natural horizon or ground, which resulted in a fatal outcome. Why is this statistical data important? Would you be aware that the cost of an instrument rating for a helicopter pilot is a whopping $65,000 in Australia, though little more than half of that in the U.S., to fly the same aircraft? A large part of the cost is the extra flying hours required by CASA over-regulation that must be administered by a Part 141 or 142 flying school versus, let's say, an independent flying instructor. On CASA's website, Part 61 specifies, quote-unquote, to gain your instrument rating, you need to hold at least a private pilot license. You also need to complete flight training at a Part 141 or Part 142 training operator. In addition, you need to have the following aeronautical experience in aircraft of the same category that the flight test is to be conducted in, 50 hours cross-country. Category is defined as either an airplane or helicopter. To reiterate, CASA requires the 50 hours cross-country experience to be in the same aircraft category for no added safety benefit. That is, 50 hours flying an airplane plus 50 hours flying a helicopter for a pilot like me who wants to fly both. By contrast, the FAA requires only 10 hours specific to the category. A Cessna 172 would cost $297 per hour versus $1,100 per hour for a Robinson R-44 helicopter, just to give you an idea of how CASA's overregulation builds in unnecessary costs to pilots. But it has not improved safety one whit, and those are minimum requirements, not what the pilot may actually need to fly to pass the test. Under the FAA, suppose a private pilot owns a 2-engine Beechcraft Baron. He will be required to hold a multi-engine class rating. Class refers to either single-engine or multi-engine. If that same private pilot wants to hold an instrument rating, he could conceivably receive all of his training for an instrument rating in a single-engine aeroplane, because there's no separate instrument rating for single-engine airplane, multi-engine airplane, single-engine helicopter, multi-engine helicopter, like there is under CASA. Again, for no added safety benefit, just added cost to pilots in the aviation industry. Under CASA, that one word class can add $22,000 to an instrument rating in a multi-engine helicopter that would offer real employment prospects. The difference for a pilot wanting an instrument rating in a typical multi-engine airplane like a Beechcraft Baron, leading to real job prospects and giving the pilot a leg up toward an airline career, rents for circa $780 per hour versus a single-engine Beechcraft Debonair at $205 per hour. That additional 10 hours required by CASA, wanting to wrap everyone in cotton wool, would cost a pilot an additional $5,750. Why? Has it made Australian skies safer? An altimeter and an airspeed indicator works the same in a multi-engine airplane as it does in a single-engine helicopter. In fact, as the holder of an FAA aircraft mechanic license, I can assure you that you will find the same instruments designed and built by Mid-Continent Instruments and Avionics installed in a wide variety of single and multi-engine airplanes, seaplanes, and helicopters. So, why does CASA demand a specific instrument rating for each category and class of aircraft? Did I end up in a crumpled heap or a smoking hole on a hillside? I have over 5,000 hours flying in actual weather, requiring sole reference to instruments. Thus, I believe a conclusion could be made due to the unaffordability of an instrument rating, and keeping it current could be contributing to Australia's aviation accident statistics. It is hard for ATSB to interview dead pilots, though. Please recall, if you will, former Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull's father, Bruce, was killed along with 2 other passengers and the pilot on 11 November 1982 in a single-engine Piper Warrior aeroplane. The pilot was not instrument rated, yet he continued visually into adverse weather conditions, probably experienced spatial disorientation while flying in cloud, which occurs in about 178 seconds before losing control of the aircraft and exceeding the design strength limits of an aircraft. That according to the ATSB. By contrast to CASA, under the FAA, I did all of my instrument training in a single-engine helicopter, yet I could fly multi-engine helicopter and became an examiner for other instrument-rated helicopter pilots, based at LAX, as busy as it is. Further, when I received my instrument training for airplanes in 1980, I did it all in a 2-engine Beechcraft Duchess and took my flight test in a single-engine Beechcraft Sierra. Yet, under the FAA, my instrument rating was valid for both single-engine and multi-engine class airplanes. I did not need to hold a multi-engine command instrument rating to fly any 2-engine airplane like under CASA. To reiterate, I maintained a perfect aviation safety record throughout my career, spanning 36 years. Not once did I inadvertently fly in a cloud. How was that even possible without the benefit of CASA wrapping me in cotton wool just in case? In Australia, the egregious costs under CASA discourages a pilot from earning an instrument rating in the first instance. And then, once he gets an instrument rating, if he hasn't been stuffing wads of cash under his mattress over the next 12 months, then he would not be able to afford to renew his instrument rating. My previous employer paid $9,000 to renew my instrument rating for me to fly a 2-engine airplane. Just to give you an idea of the cost of a renewal, that's not an initial. I've never once had to pay for an instrument rating renewal anywhere else. Please consider, I have held a current and valid instrument rating since March 1979. In Australia, I just could not afford to renew it at my own expense. Thus, it expired after I was put out of work by a shonky operator who went into liquidation owing everyone money. He owed me 8 weeks' pay, didn't pay any of my superannuation I had earned. I just couldn't afford to keep it all current. Are you beginning to get an idea just how much overregulation costs the aviation industry and pilots like me? How it limits jobs and growth of the Australian aviation industry and the economy? Further, in Australia, on the egregious cost burden of CASA's regulation, I would be required to perform an instrument rating proficiency check in the more expensive multi-engine class airplane or multi-engine class helicopter to satisfy single-engine as well. By comparison, it is only required under the FAA Regulation 61.57 to do it in the same category, which is airplane and helicopter for me. Under the FAA, I would not have to rent a much more expensive 2-engine airplane and helicopter as I would according to the CASA regulations. This one set of CASA regulations about instrument rating is a very good example where the FAA model should be introduced completely, and I emphasize completely. I believe it would save lives because more Australian pilots could afford to earn an instrument rating and keep it current. That would certainly generate more activity and flying jobs. There would be fewer instances of pilots flying airplanes and helicopters from clear weather into clouds and crashing. A fellow pilot recently confided the lack of an instrument rating has held his career back as a commercial helicopter pilot simply because he couldn't afford it. Imagine that pilot coming up with $65,000 to receive training in a Bell 206 helicopter. I did it for $2,500 in the States. Yet, he would not be able to gain employment because most employers would require him to hold a multi-engine command instrument rating, that is, learning to fly a helicopter with 2 engines, but still one main rotor/propeller, if you will, incurring greater cost to fly, let's say, an Aerospace CL-355 at $2,200 per hour. With this kind of regulatory burden, it is surprising anyone can afford to learn to fly at all, except the elite of our society. In Australia, I could only ever afford a VFR helicopter airline transport pilot license. Another set of CASA regulations to consider is the requirement to hold a night VFR rating. And again, both category and class plus proficiency checks. The FAA merely requires 3 hours of night training in category and class for a private pilot. CASA states in its advisory circular 61-05, quote unquote, flight operations conducted at night under VFR, also known as NVFR operations, are not a common practice internationally. Yet, I have enjoyed 3,263 hours flying at night during my career without CASA and NVFR rating. CASA just don't have a clue. Please consider economic recovery post-COVID and the lost employment opportunities in general aviation under CASA's egregious and verbose overregulation for no added safety benefit. This is our one opportunity to make real and meaningful change to the way Australia's aviation industry is regulated. Post-COVID, every job we will create will count toward economic recovery. The cost burden of overregulation and bureaucracy kills jobs creation opportunities in aviation. My hope is to allow you to fully understand the cost burden of the regulatory differences under CASA versus the FAA's much simpler and more practical approach. Statistically speaking, flying in Australia is no safer than in the USA, though topography combined with weather are easier here. The way CASA administers its suite of regulations is complex, expensive to comply with, does not encourage compliance, and does not provide the safety outcomes that Civil Aviation Regulation Act 1988, Section 9 mandates. It is bad enough that CASA is nothing more than a government business enterprise like Oz Post, recently in the news. But worse, it writes regulations out of fear of litigation. I believe Civil Aviation Safety Authority, along with Air Service Australia, should revert to the Department of Civil Aviation under a government Department of Transportation. I believe the federal aviation regulations should be adopted and enacted completely, not simply rebadging the complex CASA regulations with FAA-style numbering system. I believe the CEO and Director of Aviation Safety should be two separate individuals. In fact, the CEO position could be eliminated entirely, saving one fat cat bureaucrat's salary and benefits package if CASA reverted to the Department of Civil Aviation. The Director of Aviation Safety must be a pilot and hold or held an airline transport pilot license with a breadth and depth of general aviation experience, military experience, and airline experience. That is someone who is truly in touch with aviation, someone like me. The oversupply of aviation personnel will be temporary due to the COVID pandemic. Regardless, both Boeing and Airbus still predict a requirement for 248,000 pilots and 253,000 aircraft mechanics just in the Asia-Pacific region. Where will they come from? If the aviation industry is stymied by CASA's ridiculous overregulation for no added safety benefit, just greater costs to everyone involved. Australia will need to issue 457 visas for pilots and aircraft mechanics if the status quo is maintained. General aviation is being suffocated. I'm urging you, please save general aviation from CASA's chokehold. Thank you very much for listening. Do you have any questions for me?
Mr. Cassidy, thank you very much for the submission that you've written and your verbal submission just now. I'm interested, you touched on a really important point, which is, you know, the number of pilots that we know have been made redundant during COVID. And I'm interested in this point that you're making about the amount of money that it will cost for those people to maintain their accreditations, and particularly if they want to come back to work, you know, sometime soon, I hope. So what are your views on that? Do you have a recommendation specifically? Is it around a waiving of fees to renew? What would you be suggesting was the best way to go about this?
Senator, I truly had a hard time hearing you. It sounded like there was an echo in the back. But I think the gist of it was the cost of renewal for pilots and how would so many pilots being out of work be able to afford to renew their credentials. Is that correct?
Yes, I'm sorry about that echo. Mate, that's difficult for you. But the question is what would be the recommendation for CASA to ensure that we weren't losing any pilots out of the industry as a result of people not being able to afford to pay their renewal fees?
Well, personally, I don't think that CASA would really care very much, but the government as a whole should care, because what are all of these people going to do? Are they all going to work in Bunnings? I firmly believe, in my instance, when I was put out of work, and I had to apply. This was back in 2014. My employer went into a liquidation, and in the build-up to that, let me go with no notice. But according to my contract, I was owed eight weeks' pay. But I found out later that he didn't pay any of my superannuation that I had earned. So I was truly out of pocket, and I've got a mortgage and bills and so forth to pay. I applied for New Start allowance, and I begged them for assistance more than once. I got no assistance. But may I suggest, I would strongly urge the government from the top down to consider there should be interest-free loan programs like a HEX debt, for example, or whatever scheme that you can come up with for pilots and aircraft mechanics to renew or even upgrade their credentials so they can go back to work. If I could have gone back to work within the first 6 months, I imagine I'd still be working. If not here, probably overseas somewhere. I was in China for nearly 5 years flying, for example, Papua New Guinea after that, so I'm very flexible. So I think there are ways around this. We need to think about them, think outside the box, and for Senator Link to just be obstructionist and intransigent, that it's just unhelpful. And it almost feels like they want to have an underclass of people. They need to have an underclass of people. Use us as a whipping boy. And I'm desperate. I'd love to go back to work. I miss flying desperately. And I feel young enough I can still do it. And why not? I hope I've answered your question, Senator.
Yeah, thank you. So I want to explore too the cost of obtaining a helicopter or pilot's license. This is certainly something that I'm well aware of, and unless you're fortunate enough to get an apprenticeship or a traineeship with an airline, then it's pretty cost prohibitive to most young people. So is that correct that you're saying that in Australia the cost of a helicopter license would be around $65,000 as opposed to the US, where I can't recall what was the amount that you were quoting there?
Senator, that $65,000 was for instrument rating for helicopters. To get, let's say, a private pilot license or so in a helicopter, it would be much more. You might be pushing as much as $80,000. It depends on which flying school you go to and which aircraft you fly, and if you can put cash up front on the counter. Many. In fact, when I was calling around to get cost estimates to present to this committee, someone suggested I would have to put $10,000 up front and as a deposit, and it's just like, they just make it too hard. They really do.
Yeah, well, that's a significant barrier to entry for young people, particularly into general aviation. And, I guess there's a couple of elements to how that cost is built up. I'm intrigued. You've certainly had a very interesting flying career, and your love of flying is evident. I reflect on that regional Queensland used to have flying competitions where local pilots would compete to drop bags of flour on a target, and things that people used to get a lot of enjoyment out of. And of course, none of that happens anymore. I'm not sure if it's because the lack of aircraft regionally, or if it was some sort of regulatory restriction that could happen. But it's, you know, as I travel around regional Queensland and reflect on 100 years of Qantas, it certainly used to be a much more, it was the ability for people to fly because they loved it, as opposed to just because they were, you know, employed to do it. And you've certainly reflected on that. Is there anything else that you want to contribute today in your evidence?
Well, I think the greatest contribution that I could possibly make is to encourage the government, the federal government, to have a revamp of CASA, and especially the CASA regulations. I would strongly. I'm not trying to make Australia like the United States. In fact, I don't. I wouldn't want that. But if the government adopted the Federal Aviation Administration regulations in total, the way they're written, and just rebadge them. Put wherever it says USA, put it Australia. Wherever it says FAA, put CASA. Just keep it simple, enact those, and let us run with that. There will be an initial cost for all operators to change their operators' manuals and so forth, but the cost savings over the years of the way that their business could be managed with a much simpler regulatory system, it would save money for everybody. It would save money for aircraft maintenance, for flying instruction, et cetera, and it will trickle down, and it will generate more jobs.
I agree with that. Barriers to entry are certainly costs. Look, thank you very much for your evidence today. I have notification from the other senators that they don't have questions of you at this time, but I invite you to make any further contributions in writing if there's something you feel was overlooked today. And please go with the committee's thanks.
Thank you very much, Senator McDonald. I really appreciate this opportunity allowing me to speak.